Hey everyone, it's Jack, and today I thought I'd do something a little bit different. I thought I'd talk about how I got into Linux and why I use it and so forth. And this really was inspired by Brian. Brian had just recently left a comment saying, I'd like to know how and why you specifically became interested in Linux. Was it a work thing or simply to gain knowledge? What made you want to share your love with distro hopping with others? I think it'd be a great video. Although you might have already addressed this at a different time, your videos are great and you're so relatable and likable. Thank you. Well, thank you, Brian. I appreciate that. And I think that's an awesome question. You know, when I read that, it kind of made me say, yeah, you know, I would kind of like to share that. So I thought I'd dedicate a whole video to it. And as far as was it a work thing or simply to gain knowledge? Well, it was actually just simply to gain knowledge, but a little bit of a work thing. And I'll kind of get into that when I start telling why I became interested or how. And also, what made me want to share it, I guess I was into internet business and had an internet business blog for years. So I really kind of got used to getting out there and sharing my experiences and advice with a lot of people, and I really enjoyed it. And I kind of like teaching things anyway. It's kind of fun. In fact, on the side, lately I've been teaching Her Majesty the Queen of England some of the finer points of American culture. Okay, I think I got it now. Oh, there ain't no hair on the billy goat's butt. Oh, I got it. Bully for me. Oh, how liberating. Such fun. Now, Jack, you must promise me never, ever, ever to make this public. Am I perfectly clear? Yes, promise. I have a royal image to uphold, you know. I understand. Very good then. Until our next lesson, ta. Until next time. Yeah, but anyway, as you heard, she didn't want to make this public, so don't tell anybody. It's our secret, okay? Because she'd get really mad. I remember the last time I did something dumb, I got beamed on the head with her royal scepter, and yeah, that really left a mark. Anyway, when I first started using computers, the first operating system I ever got on was MS-DOS, and I think back then it was 5.0. And even though I was using DOS at the time, I think the most current Windows was probably 3.1, probably 3.0 or 3.1, and then you had 3.11 Windows for workgroups as well. But with my first computer, my first dabble into it was with Microsoft DOS, and I learned to use the command line, and I had a friend that was really into computers. He owned a computer shop. He was kind of my mentor because I didn't know what I was doing on a computer back then, and this was like in the early, probably mid-90s, I would say. My dad used to have a computer and he was on it all the time. In fact, he would program and do all kinds of stuff on there. And I just did not see the light back then, believe it or not. I was a teenager, and he would spend hours on there programming and doing all kinds of stuff. To me, I just thought, man, what a waste of time. Yet video games weren't a waste of time in my mind. So yeah, go figure. It really wasn't until the mid-90s when I inherited a computer from somebody that had brought it into my shop, because at the time I was working in a TV repair shop in Florida, and I managed that place, and we worked on TVs and VCRs and camcorders and the like. And one day somebody carried in a computer, I think it was a 286 with like 8 megabytes of RAM, or maybe it was 4, who knows. But it had gotten struck by lightning, and he wanted to know if I would write it off so he could turn it into his insurance and get a 486 DX266. That was the king at the time. So I'm like, yeah, sure. I did the deed and took in the computer. He gave it to me, said I could have it. And that was the first time I ever really decided to sit down and take a look at one. Turned out the computer just had a bad modem in it. It got struck by lightning, and I pulled out the card and it started working. And then I stared at it when it fired up. And so I stared at it and it stared at me, and I didn't know what to do. So that's when my friend came in and he started teaching me about computers, and I absorbed everything like a sponge. In fact, in about 6 months, I was teaching him stuff. And that kind of surprised even me, because I started out totally ignorant when it came to computers. But I was technically inclined, which helped. So I think maybe that could have been a little plus. So given that I started out on Windows, I started riding over to Miami with my friend to different computer shows. And then I started coming across other alternatives to DOS and Windows. And here I was seeing presentations on things like OS2 Warp eventually. But OS2, I think, was one of the things that I saw that I thought was really cool. And I thought, wow, this is even better than Windows. And then I discovered BOS. And I think they had a computer too, a custom computer called a B-Box or something like that. And BOS to me was even more fascinating, because you could have your own workspaces, and I think you could even have different backgrounds in those different workspaces, and even different resolutions, which to me was just amazing. Wow, you could have one screen resolution in this workspace and another one in that. And the memory spaces were kind of compartmentalized, if I remember right. What I thought was particularly fascinating was you could install a driver and you didn't have to restart your computer like you did in Windows. So I really thought BOS was probably going to be the competitor to Mac and Windows that would really kind of take things over. And then eventually I was back in Windows again, because really everything that I had a lot of different programs and apps and things like that, and they only worked on Windows, so I couldn't really do much in anything else. And Mac was kind of out of the question at the time, because back then I was somewhat poor, and so buying a Mac was a little bit out of my range. So it was Windows. And besides that, I really liked the x86 architecture, because I could modify it, I could build my own computers, and all the parts were relatively universal, as opposed to the proprietary nature of Macs, where you couldn't just go out and buy parts and shove them in there and they'd work. You'd have to get something that was actually intended for a Mac. So that kept me on the Windows side. And I kept using Windows throughout the 90s. And there was a couple times in the 90s where I had discovered Linux. I don't remember what flavor now. It was probably a Red Hat or something like that. And I remember the first edition of Linux I ever had downloaded happened to be a KDE. And back then I didn't know the difference between a KDE or GNOME based, but those seemed to be the two main things at the time. So I had a KDE and I thought the Linux was really nice. I really liked it and I was pretty impressed with it. But again, I couldn't run anything on it other than what was available for Linux in their repositories. But as far as the apps that I currently had and played with and stuff like that, and even some of the games, I couldn't run on Linux. So that was kind of a downer, but Linux always had me intrigued. I wanted to keep kind of playing with it. So I always had Linux kind of off on the side as like a sideline computer, so to speak. But Windows was still my main thing. And by Windows 98, I was getting even more locked into Windows. And then along came, I think it was Windows Millennium, and I thought, well, this sucks. So then, not long after that, I think Windows 2000 Server came along down the line, and I decided to install that as my OS of choice. And Windows 2000, I gotta admit, was a great operating system. I really liked 2000. It was the first time that I could actually run Windows and not have a huge headache over drivers, and it was stable. I felt like at the time if they just stopped right here, they'd be great. So yeah, and it turned out over the decade, Windows kind of went on this good suck, good suck, good suck cycle. You know, They had one good release, and then the next one sucked, and then it was good again, and then it sucked. And yeah, Windows was kind of a love-hate relationship, but all my favorite apps, again, were all in Windows. But all the while, I kept Linux kind of off on the side. I'd always have a little box or something set up with Linux, and I would just kind of play with it off and on, but not real seriously. Windows was still my go-to thing, and as the years progressed, it got more frustrating because spyware became more and more prevalent. I would just put up with it, but I was also an IT guy by now, and I was working with the local school district as an IT director. Everything was Windows-based, and the servers were Windows-based. And then I decided, I don't like so much Windows, so I got some Novell servers in the mix. And so Novell was kind of reliable. However, it was something different than Linux, but it was kind of similar in some ways too. So I really kind of liked the Novell route when it came to servers, and so I went that way. And we even ran an application called Border Manager, and I got really good with Border Manager. But after a while, Border Manager got to the point where it was just becoming really unstable. So finally, I decided I'm going to set up a Linux box. So I set up a Linux box and installed a server app on there that would take the place of Border Manager. And I can't even remember what it was now, but it was something free and open source. And it was the most stable, rock solid server that I ever had. And it never gave us a problem. Whereas the other one that we were paying like $4,000 a year for was a constant headache. And we were always calling in Novell technicians. So, wow, what a game changer. And that really made me take another look at Linux, a closer look on a desktop perspective. By that time, Ubuntu was kind of new on the scene, if I remember right. And I remember getting a copy of Ubuntu. And I thought, wow, this is even better than the other ones I was using. Most of the time I was always kind of downloading some spin of Red Hat, I think. So Ubuntu was kind of a new kid on the block, and it really got my attention a lot more than the previous Linux distros that I had looked at. When I was in GNOME-based stuff, I still didn't like it as much as KDE. I thought KDE was a lot more appealing visually. So I went in there and kind of stuck with KDE-based stuff. Ubuntu was kind of my new thing for Linux, and I started using it, but it still wasn't my main thing. I didn't replace anything, however, except for on the server level. I started slowly getting more and more Linux-based servers into the mix where I worked, because the Linux-based servers never crashed on me. Whereas Windows servers, they were always crashing. And in fact, a lot of times I'd get a call on the weekend or on a holiday or whenever, and I'd have to run down to the school and reset the server because it crashed and people couldn't access into the school. Or at the time, I think we even had an Exchange server briefly set up, and people couldn't get their emails. So Microsoft was always a thorn in my side. It was just a source of constant headaches, instability. So the more I could replace with the Linux, the better. And I was able to replace a lot, but not everything with Linux, because we had gotten ourselves locked into different contracts, and it would have been impossible for me to get totally out of it, at least in less than 5 years. However, eventually, I decided to start dual booting rather than just having an off-to-the-side computer or a laptop laying around with a Linux on it. So that's kind of around the time I discovered dual booting and deciding that that was kind of a cool option. That way, when I wanted to work in a Linux environment, I can be in Linux, and then when I had to be on Windows to use my Photoshop or what have you, then I could do that. I could boot into Windows. Even though it was kind of a pain to have to boot out and boot back in if I needed to use a Windows app, it wasn't that much of a pain. Being that it wasn't no longer out of sight, out of mind, I found myself in my Linux environment a lot more often, because just surfing the internet and doing things like that, it was so much faster on the Linux boot than it was when I was in Windows. And I know that with Windows, the longer you have it, the slower it gets. That's just kind of the nature of the OS. And so it's like every 6 months or so, I would have to reinstall my Windows just to get it perky again. I never had to do that in Linux. That was another pattern I noticed. So then I thought, I wonder if I could just transition totally over to Linux and just not use Windows. So I started going over a list of all the apps that I had to use that I could not live without, like Office and Photoshop, I think I was using at the time, stuff like that. And of course I was running an internet business, so I had to make sure that certain softwares I could use all the time, screen captures and things like that. So I thought, well, if I can replace all of those in Linux, maybe I could just convert over. And so I started researching them one by one, and I found replacements for every single one of them, even Photoshop, which I thought I never could do. And that turned out to be GIMP. And GIMP in the beginning I didn't like that much because I was used to Photoshop. But then the more I understood GIMP and the more I got myself using it, the more I realized this is a pretty good app actually. I can do everything in this that I can in Photoshop. So that was kind of the final piece that made me take the plunge, and then I converted over. And then after a little bit of distro hopping, the distro I settled on was a distro called SolidXK, or originally SolidX, and then I kind of moved up to XK because that was kind of the KDE version of the distro. And SolidX is a Dutch distro. I believe it's based on Debian. And so Debian was something I came to kind of relate to since I was using Ubuntu anyway. And so that was really kind of my daily driver for a while. By this time, Linux was not only my OS, but it was kind of a hobby. It was really a lot of fun to be able to get in there and understand the configuration and really learn the guts of it. And I guess when I started setting up servers, the server I had set up back when I was with a school district, like I was telling you before, that replaced Border Manager, that was actually using Slackware. So Slackware, that was a headless server, of course. Just everything was done in the console terminal, and Slackware really worked out great. But I'm getting off on a tangent. Anyway, back to SolidXK. That distro really worked nice, but I just kind of wanted to keep exploring, so I was kind of hopping a little bit here and there, but I was kind of hopping on the side. I just kept SolidK as my daily driver, and then in a virtual environment or sometimes on my laptop I would run other distros just to kind of explore them and see what they were all about. And in the meantime, I had suggested to Mrs. Boss, my wife, that she try out Linux because we were running a e-commerce business. We were really into e-commerce and selling physical products online. So she was on the computer all the time, and it was constantly giving her headaches. She was having spyware problems all the time and all kinds of slow issues and so forth. And so I suggested it, and not surprisingly, her response was,
no. Change bad. Windows might be worse, but change is bad too.
So, yes, she didn't budge. But about a year later, it got so bad, it got to the point where if she opened up one of her large Excel sheets, it would take 5 minutes for that sheet to open. And her internet was ungodly slow. And I was constantly having to clean off the spyware and everything else on her system. And sometimes I would have to reload it in, reinstall. And so it was a constant headache. Finally, she got to the point where she was so fed up that she was willing to try anything, even Linux. So I converted her over to Linux, and I think at the time I installed Manjaro Cinnamon. And Manjaro was something I had recently discovered at that time and was really getting to like it a lot. It was a great gateway into Arch Linux, because Arch I was always a little bit intimidated by, even back then, to put on as a daily driver, because I really didn't have the time to invest to put so much work into setting up an operating system from scratch. So Manjaro kind of came along and said, it doesn't have to be that much work. You can have Arch Linux in a done-for-you package, just like the other distros. So anyway, she was thrilled with Linux. When she got the Linux, she was just amazed. She couldn't believe it. She just ranted and raved about it for days, about how fast the internet was and how quick her Excel document would load just instantly. She became a believer right away, like within the first few minutes of seeing it perform. She never looked back, and neither did I, frankly. So yes, that was kind of where it went. And then from there, with the Manjaro, I was so taken with Manjaro that I recommended it to all my family. My brother converted from Windows to Linux, and I got him converted over on Manjaro. And I think he was running Manjaro XFCE, if I remember right. And then I kind of switched over to Manjaro, and I was using the KDE version, I think. From there, I just kind of, my daily drivers just would stay around for about a year or so, and then off to something else. And for some reason, I went from Manjaro to some other, I think I discovered Debian. And so I got into Debian, and then I ended up eventually into Arco Linux. When that came about, that was something new that kind of came on the horizon. I think it was called something else before that. I don't recall, but when it became Arco Linux, I found that really intriguing because they had this learning kind of path that they laid out, and there was these different distros available or versions, which to me was really confusing at first. And so it took a little bit to kind of sort it all out. But once I did, you know, I think in the beginning I settled on Arco Linux B. Those were the pre-configured ISOs where you would download the ISO of the desktop environment of your choice was in that ISO. So that was kind of neat. And by that time, I got to thinking, you know what, this is so much fun just using Linux and kind of distro hopping and everything that I think I'd kind of like to talk about it more, because people were always coming to me about how do you do this and what's that Linux stuff. I ended up recommending it and installing it for so many people that it was irritating Mrs. Boss. She was like, you really don't need to be spending all your time messing with Linux with other people. So I decided, I got a YouTube channel. It's been sitting around for 12 years, and it's been about 12 years since I put anything on it. Maybe I should make use of it. And what better use than to share the gospel of Linux? And so that's kind of how that got started, I think. And actually, the first videos I made, I started out actually doing programming videos where I was doing programming tutorials. And then I kind of worked my way into the Linux thing. And in the beginning, I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to do Linux videos all the time, or if I would kind of have to stick to programming. I thought I'd let the audience kind of dictate that. So when I finally did decide to throw in a Linux review, it went over so well. My views were like triple, quadruple the views that I was getting on the other videos. So that was telling me something. So the more I kind of started transitioning into more Linux videos, the better responses that I got and the more engagement I got. So I realized that, okay, yes, I am going in the right direction, because I think you should always let your audience kind of help you where you should go. Otherwise, I'll be talking to crickets. So there you have it. I hope I didn't ramble too long there. That was my story, and I hope somebody found it enlightening, or at least didn't fall asleep too quick. And with that, I hope it was helpful. And Brian, thank you. I'm really glad you chimed in there and left that comment, because that really inspired me just reading it, saying, hey, wow, yes. So I hope this video was helpful, and if it was, don't forget to leave that thumbs up and hit subscribe. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.